So I wanted to talk to you about this cloning and the rewilding of the mammoths and all of that stuff.
Yes.
I'm going to Colossal tomorrow to learn a little bit more about it myself.
Explain Colossal.
Yeah, so Colossal Biosciences is this, if you ask me, incredible company, and they are, by their own declaration, a de-extinction company. So it's this guy, Ben Lamb, and he's got George Church, who's a world-leading cellular scientist. I don't know the specifics, of de-extinction and cloning and CRISPR and so on and so forth. And they've come together and raised a ton of money, and they are de-extincting animals. And the science is there. Like, it's done. All it took was the money, basically, behind it. And they've put together this incredible Rolodex of scientists and people, and it's real-life Jurassic Park with purpose.
Where are they going to put them?
So there's a couple different things going on. So the first one they're working on is the woolly mammoth, right? And this isn't just for fun. This has real, important conservation implications, which is really fascinating. But they are planning on starting with, I think, 100 mammoths and putting them in this place called not Pleistocene Park, something like that. This park in Siberia. That they've been doing this experiment on as to what happens when you add megafauna back into the Arctic tundra to offset carbon emissions.
Wow. And so they're using what DNA? They're using elephant DNA and mixing it with something else?
So it's Indian elephant is the closest living relative to the woolly mammoth.
And what does an Indian elephant look like? Is it similar to an elephant?
Yeah, it's a smaller. So African elephants are bigger. They have the really big ears.
Right.
Indian elephants are typically the ones you'd see at the circus, with the pink in the ears, the smaller triangular shaped ears. So just a different species of elephant. And so they're taking Indian elephants and they're using CRISPR technology and they're using existing mammoth DNA and they're making an embryo and then they're implanting it into the Indian elephant, and 22 months later, an Indian elephant's gestation period, she will give birth to a mammoth.
A real mammoth?
A real mammoth.
So it's not like a hybrid?
That's okay. That's a good point. So it is, in the sense of what they do is, if you imagine the DNA of an animal, right? And then you imagine the fragments that are broken out of it, right? What they're doing is they're taking that DNA and I don't understand the cellular side of it very well. This is just my base level understanding of it. I can talk about the conservation side of it, but they're taking that double helix, that DNA, and all those pieces that are missing from the mammoth, they're putting in Indian elephant pieces. So you end up with an animal that is physically and morphologically identical to a mammoth, but has used all of the DNA from the closest living relatives in order to get there.
Phew. Boy. And this process, how long does this take?
So I think they've been going for about 5 years on the science, but the science of de-extinction and cloning, I mean, you remember Dolly the sheep, right? That was like a known thing. So that's been going on for a long time.
Well, you can get your cat cloned.
Exactly.
Or your dog cloned.
Exactly. For like 20 grand, you can clone your dog. Yeah. So
it's kind of creepy.
It is. It's bizarre. But the point is the science has been there for a while. There just hasn't really been the funding or the motivation for it. But what I think so fascinating, the reason I'm so emotionally invested in it, is the conservation implications that it has. Because what this company is ultimately doing is rewilding species that humans have removed. And that's going to, in theory, in a lot of places, sort of fix the offset, the imbalance of the ecosystem.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. There's a lot of debate about whether or not humans killed off the woolly mammoth, though, isn't there?
I think there is. Yeah, I think there is. And I can't really speak on that. But I do know that when the mammoths disappeared, so the Arctic used to be like the savannas of Africa. It used to be big grasslands, right? It wasn't all covered in trees and things. And that's a recent adaptation since the mammoths went away 10, 20,000 years ago. And so that's what's happened is the permafrost up there is melting pretty rapidly, right? Underneath that permafrost is like 1.5 trillion tons of carbon. And once that carbon enters the atmosphere, it heats things up like crazy. So by removing those mammoths, and I can explain why the mammoths keep it colder, but by removing those mammoths, it's allowing that permafrost to melt much quicker and release more carbon. So the idea from a financial standpoint of how they make money is the carbon offset of putting mammoths back into the environment.
How do they make it colder?
So it's a couple different things. It's basically when there's trees and shrubs, they take in more heat, and that heat transfers into the ground. So in this Pleistocene Park, this park that they've been doing this experiment in Siberia for a while, they've put in a couple hundred animals that aren't mammoths, right? They've put in ox and reindeer and things like that, and they're knocking trees over with the tractors. And once they knock trees over and they simulate a mammoth knocking the trees and shrubs over, the fleet grazers are able to keep the vegetation from regrowing. So when the vegetation doesn't regrow, you get all this grassland, and the grassland has snowpack. The snowpack gets stumped, so there's no insulation. It reflects more light. It's like 3 or 4 different processes that make the ground, I think on average, it's like 8 degrees colder. So it keeps things more frozen. So once we removed all the megafauna from the Arctic through hunting or maybe other means, regardless, once they were removed, the Arctic got warmer. The Siberia and Alaska got warmer, and so slowly we're getting more and more carbon emissions from up there. But by putting these animals back, and I just love the idea of going up to the Arctic and it looking like the African savanna, right, with all of these incredible animals. But by putting these animals back, it in theory will make the Arctic colder, slow down the melting of the permafrost, which will in turn trap the carbon for longer in the ground.
So they're going to start with the woolly mammoth.
Yeah.
And what other animals are they thinking about doing this to?
So what I know of right now is the woolly mammoth and the thylacine, which is another reason I'm so excited.
So they are going to bring back the thylacine.
Yeah.
And how are they going to do that?
So there's, it used to be the quoll, but now it's an animal called a dunnart that's the closest living relative. And so, thylacines were around pretty recently, right? I mean, we're just looking at video of one. Yeah. So they have really good DNA from the thylacine, and then they're going to use the existing DNA from a dunnart, which is a very small marsupial, put them together, remake the thylacine. The only problem is, my understanding is, they cannot use the dunnart for surrogacy because the dunnarts are like this big. So they have to do an artificial womb and all of that. But yeah, I think the technology is there.
Womb.
Yeah.
This sounds like a fucking horror movie.
Isn't it crazy we're living in this time?
Yeah, it sounds like a horror movie.
But it's so insane. Like, even 3 years ago, if you're like, hey, we're bringing animals back, we're going to put mammoths back in the Arctic, you're like, shut up. Like, go put on your tinfoil hat. Like, it's happening. It's
when
so
are they
crazy.
projecting the first woolly mammoth will be launched?
2024.
What?
Yeah.
Next year?
Next year. End of next year.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
And they're going to bring it to Siberia.
And put it in this Pleistocene park where there are all these other animals, and they're going to see how it does. Like, how does it behave? How does it interact with the environment? Does it replace the tractors in the sense of cooling down this little park area? Yeah. It'll be fascinating.
Are they going to do saber-toothed tigers?
I hope so. No, I don't know.
Shit,
I don't know.
That would be incredible. What a wild animal those must have been to look at.
Saber-tooths?
Giant teeth.
Yeah.
Like literally hang out of their mouth. And apparently are so sensitive that they could find jugulars. Like
with those teeth?
Yeah. They could feel the pulsating jugular with their teeth.
Just because of the nerve endings in it? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's amazing.